Welcome to the first locally led forestry stewardship webinar series of this fall with NACD. My name is Laura Meyer. I work with KR Creative Strategies. I'm joined by Colton Meyer, also with KR Creative Strategies. We're supporting the National Association of Conservation Districts in hosting and organizing this webinar series. So this morning, we're really excited to give a stage to some folks from New Mexico to talk about their experience with community-led conservation on federal lands and using Good Neighbor, the GNA agreements as part of a tool that's helped them achieve that. And before I turn it over for our speaker intros, just wanted to spend a quick minute on some housekeeping. We've all done these enough before to know that you come in on mute, and we ask that participants please stay on mute. We'll have time at the end, at least probably 15-20 minutes at least for Q&A at the end, so lots of time for conversation at that point. These sessions will be recorded and be available via the NACD YouTube channel, so keep that in mind to share with others if you think this topic and the presentation might be of use for other folks in your network. Our next webinar in this series will be on October 30th at 1 p.m. Eastern, and we'll hear an update from Conservation District folks in North Carolina on their GNA work there. So more details to come on that announcement. So yeah, before I do our speaker intros, I just want to turn it over to Annika to see if she has any other comments about NACD or from the NACD front.
Thank you, Laura. So Annika McGurk with the National Association of Conservation Districts. I'm the organization's forestry program manager. We have a national forestry program that has long been financially supported through cooperative agreements with the Forest Service's Forest Stewardship Program. Just like the districts are operating in lots of geographies and cross-jurisdictionally, us here at the national level are doing the same. And we're really excited to learn more about how you all are utilizing these agreements. You know, shared stewardship is such a tool in our toolkit, especially as we look at pairing conservation districts and that locally led perspective and their skills and dedication with our federal partners to achieve landscape scale conservation aims. So we're so glad you're here, and I'm going to turn it back to you, Laura.
Thanks. So we're pleased to introduce our two speakers today. First, we have J.R. Logan, the Consulting Watershed Coordinator for Taos Soil and Water Conservation District and owner of the Del Medeo Forestry LLC. He leads collaborative forest restoration and watershed projects across northern New Mexico, working closely with land grants and the Carson National Forest to strengthen community-based stewardship. He holds a master's in natural resource stewardship from Colorado State University and lives with his family in San Cristobal, New Mexico. And our other speaker is Grace Powell. She leads the Forest Health Program and GIS initiatives at the Taos Soil and Water Conservation District. Originally from an Oregon farm, she brings a deep commitment to land stewardship and community-based conservation. Grace holds degrees from the University of Oregon and Oregon State University and collaborates with OSU and the U.S. Geological Survey on forest health research. She lives in Des Montes, New Mexico, where she enjoys trail running and caring for her small farm. So with that, we'll turn it over to our speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. Really pleased to be invited to give this presentation. Fair warning, this is a really administrative heavy presentation. So it's a lot about paperwork, but we've tried to use our story here as a case study of what Good Neighbor Authority offers to soil and water conservation districts in terms of co-management opportunities, resource management opportunities, building a local economy, but really in the case of what we're going to talk about today, addressing real concerns that exist on federal lands but are are at some point going to impact private landowners who, we represent on behalf of the Soil and Water Conservation District. So here's a quick sort of rundown. These are the three things I want to talk about. The issue that is front of mind for us here in northern New Mexico is wildfire, especially catastrophic wildfire. We've been impacted by successive waves of mega fires really since the early 2000s, and conditions only seem to be getting worse for these kinds of supercharged fires that are well outside the normal range of variability for our area and our forest types, and are having really serious consequences both for homeowners who are losing homes, but also, in the long run, having major impacts to watershed function and the availability of water and the quality of water in a really already arid part of the country. We'll talk about how the Good Neighbor Authority, which is enacted by federal legislation, sort of trickles down to the ground. We'll talk through the nuts and bolts of how we first took that authority and applied it using a partnership with the county government here in Taos, New Mexico, and are now expanding that to a new agreement with directly between the local national forest and the Soil and Water Conservation District. And then we'll talk about kind of how the negotiations, the horse trading goes between the district in this case and our federal partners about where we want to work, how we want to work, how that work gets funded. And really, I think, press the point that this gives districts and the local community not just a seat at the table, but actually a lot of leverage to take our priorities, our management priorities, and make sure they're heard and then implemented on federal lands. So just to get our bearings a little bit, Taos County is in north central New Mexico. We're on kind of the west slope of the Sangre de Cristo Range. This is a kind of the southern end of the Rocky Mountains. It's been settled, since time immemorial by native and indigenous peoples, and then it's one of the actually oldest European settlements in North America. The Spanish arrived in the northern Rio Grande area starting in the late 1500s, and so the communities and the people who live here, many of them have been here for generations, 10 or more, and have a real deep connection with the land and the community here. And so for the district, that drives this mission of trying to maintain that culture, but also the traditions and the lifeways that are so deeply ingrained here for centuries. All right, this audience is probably gonna feel really silly. This is like kindergarten level forest ecology, but we're gonna breeze through this real quick because it's important to kind of set the stage of what we're looking at. We in Taos County in northern New Mexico, we have a lot of dry forest types. That's frequent fire forest types that generally were maintained by natural and then human caused surface fires that really maintain the structure and composition of our ponderosa pine and our dry mixed conifer forests. That's kind of how fire behaved here for eons. But of course, the story here is so similar to the story across the American West. We saw really heavy impacts from grazing in the late 1800s, which took those fine fuels out of these forests, coupled with getting really good at stomping out every single fire that starts on the forest, and created dog hair thickets with a lot of fuels growing up in the understory because of that fire exclusion and the heavy grazing, and starting to see fire behavior that looks a lot more like this. Fire behavior that's not just burning across the surface of the forest and really serving its ecological role, but actually running crown fires pushed by longer fire seasons and more intense winds and deeper prolonged periods of droughts. This is the challenge that we face. And the impacts, this image that's on the screen right now is from the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fire. This was in 2022. This fire touched into Taos County, but most of the effects were actually on the east slope of the Sangres. We saw incredible flash flooding and debris flows right after that fire that impacted a lot of homes and communities and roads and infrastructure. But the actual impact to water, both the traditional producers in this area, they irrigate with gravity-fed ditches called acequias that are in some cases hundreds of years old. This is not infrastructure that can withstand major erosion and flood events. And so we've lost a lot of productive irrigated land in northern New Mexico because of that fire, and we're starting to see the social and the economic and the cultural impacts of this fire really playing out as people are forced to move. So This map is going to get at why we at the district and at the county really pursued a good neighbor agreement. You know, we've had a partnership with the Carson National Forest for years in one way or another, collaborating on projects, making sure that our planning lined up with their planning, and we were working on both sides of the fence when it came to fuels reduction and forest restoration work. Um, this map is from the 2020 New Mexico Forest Action Plan, and this was the first real attempt to quantify fire risk across the state. This is a clip of that fire risk. It's all relative for Taos County. You can see that area on the east side, where those are the forested lands of Taos County. They also happen to be the headwaters of basically every river that has a community living at the mouth and in the valley lands. These are the debris flow estimates. These are by volume. So, you know, all of us know the fire is not the only effect. It's the post-fire environment. It's the fact that we're going to see a lot of erosion. We're going to see a lot of impacts to water quality and quantity into communities below. We use these maps to prioritize where we need to work and how to get the most bang for our buck and mitigate to the extent possible the effects of a major wildfire. And then this map really tells the story. Anything in green is national forest lands as managed today. So almost all, with the exception of the far northern portion of the county, that area with the highest fire risk, that area with the highest risk of debris flow in a post-fire environment is almost entirely managed by the Carson National Forest. So if you're a citizen who lives in an inholding in one of these communities that relies on the water that comes out of those watersheds, you have a lot to worry about the condition of those federal lands. But in order to help in this case, the Carson National Forest get work done, support their limited capacity, support their limited budget, there has to be a mechanism for, in this case, the Soil and Water Conservation District to step up and bring our resources and expertise to bear. The last slide, and this is my favorite one in the deck, is the social component of the complexity up here. Northern New Mexico, like I said, has been populated by indigenous and Hispanic people for centuries. And when the U.S. Forest Service was created in 1906, there was already 250 years of European settlement here and thousands of years of indigenous forest management. And people then and still today do not trust or like the Forest Service in general. There is a lot of bad blood. There's a sense of you took our livelihoods off of the national forest by putting in rules and regulations. You've taken our birthright from us. This was land that we have a deep connection to, and now you're claiming to own it. And so that sense of the forest is now the problem of the federal government, and the local people shouldn't or can't have a say in what happens on that land is a real impetus for wanting to get an agreement in place that turns down the temperature on that relationship, but also leads to some really practical project work that's more rooted in what the community wants to see. So that lays out our crisis. I won't go through these bullets, but the gist is, given that milieu, given that environment of these are our natural resource concerns, these are our concerns about the wildfire crisis, and then these are the social complexities around why work and partnerships haven't been able to happen before. That's where the Good Neighbor Authority, which I learned about kind of half listening to a webinar exactly like this one during COVID, just became such an obvious tool to address both the resource concerns, but also the community concerns around we don't really have a hand in what happens on most of the forested land in our area. This matrix comes from a handout that a buddy of mine who works for the Forest Service gave me. And I should put it up because I suspect a lot of this audience is familiar with the different flavors of agreements that authorize partnerships with non-federal entities, both on the BLM and on Forest Service lands. And I highlight in this red box the Good Neighbor Agreement just to point out that this is a yes all the way down for all of these ecological restoration activities in the far left column. So, you know, in the case of Taos Soil and Water Conservation District in Taos County, we've focused on fuels reduction and forest restoration, but we have all opportunities essentially to step up and bring our resources to bear, help bring funds to the table to do this long laundry list of activities on Forest Service lands. So whatever is most relevant to your district and your state, that list becomes really important when thinking about, is this something we want to pursue, even if you don't have a fuels or a fire risk in the same way that we do. When we started this project and this conversation, we already had something of a cycle in place with our partners on the Carson National Forest. You know, we were planning and prioritizing work, but really the work that was happening on federal lands existed only within the supervisor's office and the district offices here. We wanted to make sure that when we pursued a good neighbor agreement with the Carson National Forest, that we built in this notion of, this is cyclical work, this is iterative work. And the folks from the community who want to be part of this, you know, they're not just here for this first entry, doing, you know, fuels reduction, pile burning, whatever it might be, and then walking away. These are folks who want to have a role in the condition of a particular stand near or in their community for, in most cases, generations. So considering that and building that sort of idea into our planning and our long-term planning and implementation was pretty critical. For a case study, I want to look at this area inside this red line. So the town of Taos, which is more or less in the center of Taos County, sits at the bottom of the Rio Fernando watershed. That's the area outlined that there in red. This is a relatively low elevation watershed for our area. It's got a lot of that ponderosa pine and dry mixed conifer that we were talking about during kindergarten forest ecology slides earlier. And it is the primary water source for the residents of Taos County, and it is ranked among the most at-risk Huck 12 watersheds in the entire country for fire risk and risk to communities and risk to water. When we started negotiating with the Carson National Forest, we approached them and said, we know you have NEPA done on the north side of this canyon. We know that you're working on planning out your 5 years worth of treatments inside of that area. And we came to them, to the forest supervisor and to the district ranger in this case, and said, we want to help, and we think the good neighbor agreement is the right mechanism to do that. They agreed, and so we started with a master good neighbor agreement. I shared that with Colton yesterday, and I understand that if anybody's interested to just look at what that document looks like, it can be made available to you all. When I heard about the good neighbor agreement for the first time, seeing those documents was really helpful to me because it gave me something to take to the district ranger and say, this is a thing that you can do as an agency, and we want to take it on. And you have to give those folks a hard pitch. They run it up the chain through the forest, and at that time to the regional office. But it starts there on the ground. These agreements start on the ground. And for us, it was really helpful to have a specific project. And so that's what's highlighted in purple on this map. There are local agricultural producers who use the water from this watershed to irrigate pastures and orchards and gardens near the town of Taos. They were concerned about the fire risk up the canyon, and they actually wanted to be part of treating the forest. One, because they want to help protect their water source, but two, because firewood in these communities is there's a chronic shortage of firewood. Almost 90% of the homes here are heated by fuel wood, and we felt there was an opportunity to recruit the local people to do some thinning work, to put firewood in the back of their pickup trucks, to pay them a little bit of money to get their work done, as a way to build local capacity and local interest in the work and in the management and planning process. So we identified that area as an area close to town, easy to access, and with the right kind of forest for what I just described. We also used some modeling on predicted fire paths. This is based on just random ignitions across the landscape and what is the topography and prevailing winds and fuels conditions most likely to do to move fire. And so again, we picked an area in partnership with the Carson National Forest and with the local folks. Yeah, that's an area that lines up. That's a place where we think essentially a fuel break could be helpful in the event of a fire. So like I said, this is an administrative heavy presentation, but this table, if there's anything else to take away from it, this I think has been the most helpful when I describe the work that we've done and how we've tried to set it up. The first step for us and for anybody who wants to pursue a good neighbor agreement to do any kind of project, including the one I was just describing, is to set up what's known as a master good neighbor agreement. And that's an agreement between your forest, in this case, the Carson National Forest. And at the time, this was an agreement between the forest and our local government, our local county government, Taos County. The master agreement basically sets the ground rules. It has no funding tied to it. It doesn't have any project work described in it. It basically says our two entities are authorized to enter into this agreement, and in the future, we want to pursue specific projects, and when and if that happens, we will get into the details in a separate agreement. And that's what this supplemental project agreement box is. That's the parlance is a SPA. Anybody who's worked in any kind of different flavor of agreements will know SPAs. This is where the rubber hits the road. This is where you talk about maps, treatment areas, describe the kinds of activities you want to do, and put money behind it. The Forest Service is able to fund SPAs on its own, and there is no match requirement from the partner, in this case, Taos County. So the first foray we did was a SPA to do kind of a potpourri of work in areas that we both were concerned about. And the Carson funded the whole thing. They plugged $1.3 million into it and said, let's try this out and see if it works. That initial investment by the National Forest made it easy for me to go to our state forester and the New Mexico Forestry Division and say, if you guys want to help in this effort, we have this mechanism. They can contribute funds. It gets built into the same SPA if you want to add more work to it, which gives us a lot of options when it comes to funding work if the Forest Service doesn't have the cash to do it or to do all of it that it wants to do. Taos County, in this case, and this box is soon to be replaced by Taos Soil and Water Conservation District. They manage the grant. They handle contractors. They handle procurement for all the different project work that we want to do. And that's this right-hand box. So any forester that needs to be hired, any forestry subcontractors to go out and do work, any road work, any third-party NEPA, all of which is allowable under Good Neighbor Agreement, that's the right side of this diagram going out of Taos County. That's the pretty standard what you do. The stuff on the left is, I think, a little more unique to Taos County, or at least how we've interpreted Good Neighbor Authority and applied it to the things that are most important to our community. So these irrigation associations, the acequias, they're political subdivisions of the state. So they're eligible to receive funds from Taos County as a government to government relationship. So if you are an irrigator on a ditch, and you're concerned about the area, the headwaters of your watershed, and there's a project you want to take on, the county can fund that with a small portion of the money that it's fundraised at the top of this chart. The same is true for land grants, which have an equally complex and are really idiosyncratic to New Mexico, but these are also political subdivisions of the state that have an interest in natural resources. The Taos Soil and Water Conservation District, when we first set this up, used funding from the Good Neighbor Agreement to do common stand exams. The goal there was to help with capacity because the Carson couldn't get enough of these common stand exams done to write prescriptions to get work done. So the district saw an opportunity to fill that gap. But as Grace is going to mention, it also became a youth development and education program that's really paying dividends when it comes to pointing local kids in our community towards careers and natural resources that allow them to stay in our community and keep doing work. And then lastly, the volunteer fire departments who exist under the county umbrella are also eligible to take qualified red carded volunteers and can be hired up to serve as resources on prescribed fire, which has been a huge advantage for us because there's a chronic shortage of qualified firefighters in our area. And there are people who live in these communities who see this work happening around them, who want to be part of the solution, maybe have run a chainsaw through these other projects, but also want to be out there helping out with using prescribed fire as a tool to get good work done. It's gone a long way in building qualifications for people who are interested, especially people who might want to go on to a career in fire. It's also gone a long way in sort of alleviating some of the issues and the fears around prescribed fire, which are really pervasive in our area. Grace, can I throw it to you to talk about the student monitoring crew?
Awesome. So as Jared was talking about, the Good Neighbor Agreement in Taos County has been a little bit different from others that I've heard about, at least, in that we've made a huge effort to engage local community members. So not only ag producers in the watersheds above them where their irrigation water is coming from, but youth as well. So back in 2018, a gentleman who worked at the Soil and Water Conservation District began this youth monitoring crew, very informal. He would pull high school students out after school for a couple hours, go out to the woods. Some of these photos are from that summer of 2018. And just take really basic measurements about the condition of the forest. So trees per acre, look at diameter classes, etc. He'd bring pizza out for them in the woods and really try to get students interested in natural resources in a really hands-on way. So that was kind of the beginning of the youth monitoring program at the Soil and Water Conservation District, really trying to engage a range of ages, backgrounds, etc., spread across the county. And since 2018, we've really formalized the program in a lot of ways with the help of the Good Neighbor Agreement and the funding that we've been able to funnel to the district and then those student monitors. And it's really exciting. I think we've had 12 monitors go through the program in the past couple of years, and 9 of them are currently pursuing higher education in natural resources at colleges around New Mexico as well as Colorado. So this was an article that we had published in the Taos News recently. I can also send a link out to folks about this. But really, this article highlighted the power of youth engagement and trying to offer them a seat at the table. You know, when we talk about natural resources, especially in Taos County, there's not a lot of folks who are actually able to do these common stand exams, which is what the district was contracted to do. And so this is not only youth education, but it's also building workforce, right? And that kind of education that comes along with that. We want these students, after they come out of the program, to be empowered to potentially start their own contracting business to complete these pre-treatment stand exams if they wanted to. So not just that education, not just getting students out into the woods, but really creating this opportunity for workforce development in Taos County. Is there one more slide? The other thing that we wanted to highlight with this program is that the world is kind of a scary place, right? And I think for a lot of young people right now, it can feel quite overwhelming, especially seeing the news and what's happening in terms of shifting climates. And so we really wanted to create an actionable way for students to participate in this work and feel empowered in making decisions about what's going on in their backyards. This is also filling a huge gap that exists within the Carson National Forest. So there are very few people who are actually conducting these pre-treatment stand exams. And so this was really helpful in filling that gap for the Carson. And we've actually been able to see projects through. So pre-treatment stand exams, collecting data on what the conditions are like. We send that data to the Carson, their silviculturalists develop a treatment, and then we're able to go and do post-treatment monitoring. And actually the past couple days in Taos County, we've had a pile burn going on in one of the treatment areas that student monitors were involved in 2018. So I've been seeing the smoke over the hill, and it's been really exciting to kind of see that project come full circle. So that has been really inspiring to see. And then, as Jara mentioned, kind of being more involved in these larger programs and getting youth out in the woods, engaging and really developing those skills to develop the workforce. So one more slide. Awesome, that's you.
Thanks, Grace. Yeah, you know, like Grace mentioned, that of all the things that we've done in Taos County, I actually think that the student monitoring crew is what I'm most proud of, because it's more than just checking a box of youth engagement where you bus a bunch of kids out there and you show them the woods and you show them what a ponderosa pine is, and then you put them back in the bus and they don't come back. Grace, since she took over the program, has been really successful at recruiting students from all 3 of the high schools in Taos County who have already an interest in natural resources, but no field experience, no obvious way to get that field experience. and no obvious way to see a pipeline and a career there. And as she mentioned, so many of the crew members, including herself and including the woman who shares an office with me, who now works for State Forestry Division, were at one time student monitors who sort of cut their teeth learning how to do stand exams and then learning kind of how to get into the system, meeting professionals who were already doing this work and seeing a real career opportunity. And so for us, in trying to build local capacity in a really rural part of the country and in a place where there's not a lot of opportunities for young people career-wise to stay here, that's been really satisfying to see. I put this slide up because, as Grace pointed out, the data that's being collected as part of those stand exams by the student monitoring crew and by the Soil and Water Conservation District is sent to the Forest Service silviculturists. They produce a treatment plan that looks a lot like this. And then in the case of the unit that we're sort of highlighting here, that prescription is then applied by the local members of the community who are issued one of these 1 acre blocks inside the fuel break that we wanted to create. And so we hired this dude, or I should say the irrigation ditch appointed this guy using the funding we provided to them, Vicente, to be, we call it a mayordomo, which is a complicated word with a lot of kind of cultural baggage around here, but it's a boss. He's the boss. It was his job to recruit his neighbors, his family, his in-laws, whoever, to be part of this project and program, to allocate the acre to them. And then it became a community effort to thin what is about an 80-acre unit over the last 2 years. This is not going to solve our wildfire crisis. You know, local people with their own equipment and their own vehicles going into the woods to cut like on weekends and after work, that's not hitting the pace and scale that's necessary. But what it is doing is it's building a lot of political and social capital and a lot of goodwill, and it's helping the people who live in these communities feel a renewed connection to areas that they used to visit as kids, areas where they did do management. They may have grazed with their parents, they may have cut firewood up there already, they may have foraged for herbs, which is still very common around here. And this, you know, Vicente's been smiling like he is in this picture for 4 years because this project and this program has given him a lot of pride and his community a lot of pride in wanting to be part of it. That political and social license helps us to expand the 70 or 80 acres that he's overseeing that look a lot like this and apply not just these little, I call them the cute forest mayordomo projects, you know, to 2 or 3 or 400 acres, but really take on thousands of acres and build more broader community support because it has introduced the community to a lot of the reasons behind why this restoration needs to happen. A little bit of the science, a little bit of the value of the forest, of the woody material coming out of there. And with the support of people like Vicente and a lot of the other community groups that we're working with, it's just helped to spread the word and get people more excited about the idea that, you know, restoration is something that not just somebody in a uniform does, but that the people who live in these communities can be part of. That is, for a lot of people around here, as good as gold. A pickup truck full of juniper posts and pinon firewood is worth every penny to the people who live here, and to have unfettered access and a permission slip to go cut as much of it as they want to while also reducing the risk of fire in their community has been hugely successful. I don't know if the sound is going to work on this video. If it doesn't, we can move on. Annika, can you tell me if you can hear it? All right, cool.
Today we are measuring common stand exams on the Carson National Forest up in Taos Canyon with our youth crew. We're doing forest monitoring, which is like basically seeing how healthy the forest is, what fire fuels we have, if a fire were to come through, how much of it's going to burn.
We take information from both the ground cover vegetation, we take a lot of canopy cover information, and then everything in between.
This whole area ends up getting laid out, flagged, leaf tree marked with orange paint for the trees that have to stay behind. And then a forest mayordomo comes in and administers the project.
The intent of this project is to trim the forest cut all those excess trees that are out there, which is fuel for a wildfire. So if a fire would get started in the meadow where we're at, it could go up into those trees and climb clear up into the top of the crowns and kill everything.
Right now, our main concern is making sure that the Forest Service knows what's going on in the woods for fires.
We start by gathering data. We have community members come in and do the thinning work, and then we come in and we measure that change.
Historically, we weren't completely aware of how important the forest was. Now we're aware of how plant associations matter for the larger forest area.
The history of what's gone on here is in those trees.
I want to come back and be able to take care of my forest where I come from.
There's lots of generations at any given time who care about our forests. And you have to incorporate all these generations.
I think letting kids come out and see this makes a huge difference, especially if they're hands-on.
The knowledge has to continue. So when these young kids take over, whoever takes over, they know what they're talking about.
We have all sorts of students come into our program with no skills, no training, and leave confident that they can create a career in Taos County and natural resources.
It was really nice for me to get out in the field because it introduced me to positions that incorporate this level of field work.
Coworkers make it fun. You get to experience things, learn different things. So it's not really like a job, you know? If you like being outside and learning about the history of what's around you, there are opportunities, and this is an amazing way to get that training. This job has taken such an impact on my life, and realizing how much our forest affects us.
I think it's super important for future generations that we maintain and help protect these forests, so they get to see what I grew up with, what we all got to grow up with.
So again, thanks Grace for that video, by the way. This is all just one tiny, cute, warm and fuzzy example of what's possible using the Good Neighbor Agreement. But if you're just focused on like accomplishing acres or spending a bunch of money, like it allows for that too. And we've also used it as a tool to accomplish that. So this sort of gives a quick timeline and some pertinent facts related to it. You know, the first agreement between Taos County and the Carson National Forest we signed in 2021. We developed our first spa about a year later. That was the $1.2 million. And now we've got a new Good Neighbor Agreement that cuts out Taos County as a middleman and actually allows Taos Soil and Water to have its own Good Neighbor Agreement, its own funding mechanism, its own direct line to funding, but also authority to do work on federal lands. So we've doubled the capacity using Good Neighbor here, and can use it as a more nimble tool. And that really is based on the success of the first Good Neighbor Agreement that we had between the county and the forest, and the value the forest saw in having a partnership through one of these and wanting to expand it. This fourth dash is really worth pointing out. So we've accomplished thousands and thousands of acres of hazardous fuel reductions in areas that were most important to the county and the soil and water district. And we've done that using $2.8 million, more or less, in Forest Service money, complemented by another $3.3 million that's been committed to Good Neighbor work. So that, you know, if you remember the diagram that I had up, that allows you to kind of shop for funding from both partners and then put it through your district to be able to accomplish money. And, you know, there's no limit to who you can fundraise from and how you can fundraise from. It just makes it really easy to funnel all of it into project work that is a priority for your district. And again, as somebody who spent, you know, a fair amount of time writing competitive grants and hoping they'd get funded, and then trying to drum up match or figure out how we were going to come up with, you know, in-kind hours, Good Neighbor Agreement takes all of that off the table. You know, it doesn't mean we don't apply for competitive grants still, but it means we're not as dependent on them as we used to be. And to reiterate, there is no match requirement for a district if you receive funding from the federal government to do work on federal lands. The agreement gives you a seat at the table. It allows you to negotiate with district staff and with forest staff. What are your priorities? Where are our priorities? Where do those overlap? And how can we be partners on a more level playing field and do co-management for all of the activities authorized under a Good Neighbor Agreement that you all want to do and that we all want to do. But it's not all rainbows and unicorns. Good neighbor agreements require a certain minimum level of capacity from a district. So you've got to have staff that are able to manage the federal reporting requirements on those. If there's bunches of federal money coming in, you need to be prepared to do federal audits, which are never an easy thing. And so just considering, your own capacity at the district level and what you think you can take on, what's the value of pursuing an agreement like this, those are really considerations to have in mind when you start. Also worth pointing out that all of our forested land, or almost all of it, is managed by National Forest, but BLM through the same federal legislation is authorized to enter into good neighbor agreements as well. So if you're in an area where BLM is the primary land manager, it's a mechanism that's available as well. Under the new administration, it's definitely worth pointing out that the executive orders related to reviving the timber industry have specifically mentioned and directed forest level staff to use good neighbor agreements to get that work done. I think the logic behind that is we want the agency to step back and we want local people to step up. Whether or not you agree with that and the policy around that, if you are a cooperator, if you are a soil and water conservation district that wants to have a hand in management, this is a great time to ask for one of these agreements, because there is a directive from Washington saying do this. And my understanding is there is a line item in both Interior's budget and the USDA's budget saying this is good neighbor money, get a good neighbor agreement in place, and then this is a special pot of funds that could be tapped into if you've got an agreement in place. The last bullet there I think is really valuable. We didn't just knock on the door of the district ranger as strangers and say we want to try this. It took maybe a decade of building partnerships and relationships and understanding the personalities at play and building trust between at that time the county, the district, and the forest in order to make this thing actually happen. So understanding who it is you need to ask, making sure that there's a relationship there, but then also, considering again whether it's valuable to your district. If you're in a position like ours where you're at the mercy of a federal land manager, this made a lot of sense. If that's not the case, maybe this is not the right tool for you and for your concerns for your district and for your constituents. So that's my neighbor Dickie Cordova with a pile of small pinon. He's the happiest guy in the valley, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody's got. Thanks again for your time today.
Thanks, JR and Grace. That provided the chart, I think, especially provided a really helpful overview of how these agreements work. So for folks attending today, a couple updates too. There's a link to that success story that Grace mentioned in the chat, and we also uploaded the master GNA agreement and supplemental project agreement that JR was willing to share. So you can find those in the chat. If you have questions, please start typing those into the chat as well. And while you're doing that, I know I have a question, so take your time, give it some thought, and I'll fire my question off for now. So JR, you had mentioned that when you were pursuing the GNA agreement, you would come to others with a pitch really about it to get buy-in. Do you have any advice on what key elements, if a conservation district or partner is really interested in pursuing this, what are some key elements that help make that type of pitch successful?
I think what was actually really helpful for us was having an example to point to. So I mentioned that I had sort of called into a webinar. I didn't know what it was about. And it was a woman from Tuolumne County in California giving a presentation very similar to what I just gave and describing kind of the nuts and bolts of Good Neighbor Agreement and how they've used it to bring in millions of dollars to do work in their community. I immediately emailed that woman after the webinar was over and asked her to share some documents with me to tell me a little bit more about the story, like the good, the bad, and the ugly, and then was able to take that to my partners with the local government entities that I work with and get their buy-in and say, this seems to be working for them. These are the issues they've had, but on whole, this has been a win for them. Get buy-in from, really my local elected officials, and then take that to the district ranger and the forest supervisor, and not just say, hey, I heard about this thing, good neighbor agreements, do you want to try it? But actually put in front of them, like, this is how it works. This is how funding can move here. This is what the paperwork looks like. This is what we have to put through the grants and agreements folks to make sure everything gets signed. And having an example to point to, and my understanding is since 2020, when I first saw that, there's been a number of counties and soil and water conservation districts that are taking advantage of this. I think those examples are more easy to find. But for me personally, knowing the district ranger and my kids playing soccer with his kids, that didn't hurt. But maybe more importantly, having something in black and white and saying, we can do this, we should do this, and we want to do this, that's a management win for them. That's a political win for them. It's a capacity win for them, and it's paid real dividends for us.
Great, thank you. So we have a few questions. First, is there still federal funding for these projects?
Ooh, that's a tricky question. I don't know. We have been told that there is, like I said, a line item in the Department of Interior and the Department of Ag budgets for good neighbor agreements to do this kind of work, but I haven't seen any of it yet. We have, with Taos County, there are 5 or 6 different spas now that add up to that $2.8 million. That's all federal funds that came in over the last 5 years. With this change in administration and the uncertainty, I'm definitely not saying no, but I'm saying I don't know. What I do know is the state of New Mexico and our legislature recognized that there is a huge gap to fill whether or not the federal funds show up. And so they set aside a huge pot of money to do this kind of work, and having an agreement in place, having work, basically shovel-ready work to pitch to them and say, hey, you should fund us using your state funds to do work where it matters to us, made it very easy to convince them to take $3.3 million in state funds and apply it here on the ground. So it's allowed us to be a little more nimble. My hope is that, yes, there is federal funds that are going to be available for this kind of work, but I haven't seen it yet. And, my read from here in the ground in Podunk, New Mexico, is it depends a lot on where you are, what the need is, and kind of which direction the political winds are blowing for you at the time. So I don't know. We'll see.
The next question is, how many SPAs originally started in the agreement, and have more started or signed on?
Yeah, we started with a single spa, which was a little bit of everything in the kitchen sink. That funded Grace and the student monitors. It funded 3 of those community forestry projects I talked about. It funded about 500 acres of more meat and potatoes thinning using professional contractors, and it paid for some road work to access those units. That first spa existed for about a year, and we drew down 2/3 of the funding from it. We, I think, proved our value as a partner and showed real results, and that made it a lot easier to start building spas below that. So I think, like I said, at the moment now, in addition to that first spa, we have 5 others. One is dedicated just to prescribed fire, and the others are dedicated to different combinations of project work spread across Taos County, but in areas where there's an agreement between the entities that this is a priority and we want to do it.
Related to that question, I have a question about what SPA stands for. Is that the Supplemental Project Agreement? Is that right?
It's the most unfortunate jargon I've come across, but that's what it stands for.
And that's one of the files, right, that you had shared and we uploaded?
That's right. That's
Okay.
right. And again, if you're a district and you do think this is worth pursuing, there's 2 levels of agreement. The first is what's called a master good neighbor agreement. That's a very boilerplate template that your local Forest Service or BLM staffer will get. You basically just plug and play the names of the 2 entities, and then all the rest of it is pretty standard language. And that master agreement just says we want to try this out, but we haven't figured out details yet. Once the master is in place, and that's pretty easy for everyone to get on board with, then you dig into the weeds on a supplemental project agreement or a SPA.
Great. And then did the G&A dollars help pay for your federal audit?
Yeah. Yep. So as with most federal grants or agreements, there's a relatively generous indirect cost rate built in. So if you look at the SPA that we shared, you'll see a few things. We Taos County received funding to spread out to all these different partners directly. So we were a pass-through for those funds. Taos County also received the funding necessary to pay me and my company all of the time that it required for me to manage the projects, do the reporting, and just make the work happen. So it was at no cost to Taos County to hire me as a contractor to do that work. And then in addition to that, the county was allowed to charge an indirect cost rate, which at the time was the de minimis, or the lowest rate of 10%. So I think on that $1.2 million, we collected $120,000 in indirect cost, and that's funding that's available to the county to pay staff, to pay for an audit, to keep the lights on, whatever it is they need to do. And I will say, in hindsight, I wish we would have been more thoughtful about making sure that we covered the cost of county staff time, because it's an allowable expense. You can build it into your financial plan. So if you look at that SPA document I shared, it'll have a line item for me. We should have had a line item for a finance director. We should have had a line item for the lady cutting the checks. We should have had a line item for anybody doing any work related to this. And this is a lesson I've heard from a lot of local governments that have taken this on, is make sure you're not giving away the work, but actually give yourself the money that you need using the agreement funds to cover your expenses. I know the lady from Tuolumne County that I spoke with originally about all this, they hired a dedicated staff person just to manage this program, in part because the workload was a lot, but also they recognized if they had a staff person that just managed the grant and that was their full-time job, they could scale it up and they could do more work because they had that capacity.
That's really helpful. So I guess, and that kind of relates to another question I had, which was about, any lessons learned as you and Grace look back over that. It sounds like making sure you're not giving away work, including line items for the human resources, all the resources it will take. Are there any other lessons learned that you can think of to share with the group?
Yeah, I mean, I would say when we first set this up, I personally was quite deferential to the forest about what kind of work we did and where. It wasn't to say we were just doing random acts of conservation. The treatment areas, the treatment polygons that they laid out on the table and said, we have this work that needs to get done. We think you guys can do it. They lined up with our priorities, but we've learned over the last 4 years that we don't need to just say yes to whatever work the Carson wants to cut off to us. We actually can use a lot more weight as a partner to say, we actually think that this area needs work done here, and we actually think that the treatment needs to be done in a different way than your civiculturist might propose. And the reason for building a new good neighbor agreement, in addition to the one with Taos County, but actually now between Taos Soil and Water Conservation District and the forest, is we think the district is actually very well positioned to flex that muscle a little bit more. And so we're experimenting with that in a community in the southern part of Taos County that is completely surrounded by national forest. It's had NEPA ready acres for years. They're ready to go. We said we want this agreement, but we want the Carson to step back even more. We want to write the prescriptions, not rely on your civiculturist. And we want community members to have more input on how the work gets done, what happens with the material. Are we looking just at fuels? Are we looking at erosion when we go in there and do the work? Are we considering wildlife habitat for the people who still hunt here, for the people who still want to see animals happy? And so it's given us more leverage, this new agreement, understanding that we have more clout as a partner to not make demands, but I think be a little more aggressive about making sure that our resource concerns and our management objectives and our management techniques are part of the conversation instead of just being a fiscal agent for money to get more of the Forest Service work done on the ground.
Great, thank you. So we had some folks ask for your contact information. That is, the email addresses for JR and Grace are in the chat. And we had a comment from Nancy Carter in North Carolina saying that her state's in desperate need for disaster relief in our mountains and at the coast, but she doubts if there will be any state funding available. And the SWCD relief response is mainly focused on debris removal from streams and biochar.
Yeah, I hear you. It feels daunting sometimes, all of it.
I'm not seeing any other questions. So again, folks, there's a link to the success story article in the chat that Grace mentioned, and both the master contract for the GNA agreement, the master GNA agreement, and then a supplemental project agreement has been uploaded to the chat for your reference. And then JR and Grace's email addresses are there. We've got one more question. Any plans for another project?
Yeah, the current one is that experiment that will be between Taos Soil and Water Conservation District and the Carson. We're starting with 1,000 acres of treatment area that the Carson has basically handed off to the district and the community members that we're working with for us to come up with a management plan. That's 1,000 acres inside of a 12,000 acre watershed. That's ready for treatment now, but also needs a plan for long-term management, 20, 30, 50 years. So we the district are using this as our own pilot to see whether the Good Neighbor Agreement and other types of agreements for different jurisdictions, different land ownerships, can help us to build more of that community-led management on federal lands in ways that go beyond what we've accomplished so far. So that 1,000 acres will be an interesting test of whether that new model, which is the same principle just expanded, can be really effective. And it's been nice to work with the community members there because they're starting to see the potential, not just for a pickup truck full of firewood and for their own house, but actually build an economy around it. Invest in equipment, invest in processing, invest in value add to the wood materials that are coming out of there, and integrate what's happening in the uplands with what's happening in the lowlands, regardless of who owns the land. And the Good Neighbor Agreement, in that case, I'm just describing it as a permission slip. It's giving the community a mechanism to be able to access those lands and do the work that they want to do. And the district's role in all of that is to be the technical advisor for the work, and to help manage the flow of money and negotiate with the various agencies how that work happens. So I'm really excited about that particular project. That one's got a big chunk of state money behind it. And if we don't screw it up, I think that will be a new model for how we think the Good Neighbor Agreement is really applicable for us.
Well, thank you both so much, JR and Grace, for your time and expertise today. There's a lot of, I hope you both take time to look at the chat. There's a lot of folks who are really appreciative, and you might be hearing from some of them. For attendees, thank you for being here, and just keep an eye out for the next webinar announcement. That'll be on October 30th at 1 p.m. Eastern, where we're going to get an update from North Carolina. Annika, any other closing comments from NACD?
Nothing from me. Thank you so much, JR and Grace. It's just nice to be inspired by our fellow districts and our colleagues, and it's just really wonderful what you're doing. And I echo what Laura said. I see a lot of, you have certainly set the spark in a good way for a number of folks to start to lead these efforts at home. So expect to hear from us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks,
everyone.
Have a great day.